down mine missing, working at the car wash blues.
Well, I should be sitting in a half-conditioned office in a swivel chair, talking some trash to the secretary, saying, yeah, partner, come on over here. But instead of stuff, pimp, rubbing these fenders with a rag and walking home in soggy old shoes. But with them steadily depressing, low down my messing, working at the car wash blues.
You know a man of my ability, he should be smoking on a big cigar.
But till I get myself straight, I guess I'll just have to wait in my rubber suit of rubbing these tars.
Well, all I can do is to shake my head. You might not believe that it's true.
Oh, working at the St. John Niagara Falls is a undiscovered Howard Hughes. So baby,
don't expect to see me with no double martini and in my highbrow society news. Cause I got them steadily depressing, low down mind messing, working at the car wash blues. To see me with no double martini and in my highbrow society news. Cause I got them steadily depressing, low down mind messing, working at the car wash blues. Yeah, I got them steadily depressing, low down mind messing, working at the car wash blues.
The fleas are placed inside the jar and the lid is then sealed. They are left undisturbed for 3 days. Then, when the jar is opened, the fleas will not jump out. In fact, the fleas will never jump higher than the level set by the lid. Their behaviour is now set for the rest of their lives.
Look at that mountain, look at those trees, look at that bum over there, man, he's down on his knees. Look at these women, ain't nothing like them nowhere. Century Boulevard, we love it. I love LA.
Shorty had them apple bottom jeans, boots with the fur, the whole club is looking. As she hit the floor, next thing you know, Shorty got low, 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 low. The baggy sweatpants and the Reeboks with the strap, she turned around and gave the big booty a smash. She hit the floor, next thing you know, Shorty got low, 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 low.
Like the pine trees lining the winding road, I got a name, I got a name. Like the singing bird and the croaking toad, I got a name, I got a name. And I carry it with me like my daddy did, but I'm living the dream that he kept here. Moving me down the highway, rolling me down the highway, moving ahead so life won't pass me by. Like a north wind whistling down the sky, I got a song, I got a song. like the whippoorwill and the babies cry. I got a song, I got a song, and I carry it with me and I sing it loud. If it gets me nowhere, I go there proud. Moving me down the highway, rolling me down the highway, moving ahead so life won't pass me by.
Broadcasting live from the Free Speech Studios. Deep within the city of Fountain, with over 4 years of satisfying the curious mind and looking damn sexy while doing it. Ladies and gentlemen, Phantom Fact Society.
Here with special guest Andrew Schaalman to join us to talk about The Turning, which I had heard about for, quite a few years. I've listened to one of the greatest podcasts in the universe. Some may say the No Agenda show. And they had mentioned this before in the past. And after having that interview with C.S. Lark, she mentioned Andy Schaalman. And so we looked into some of his videos there on YouTube, The Generation Report. And we're happy to have Andy after that long, wondrous intro. I hope you're not nervous.
No, that's great. I love me some AI Elvis. Fantastic.
Well, it was his 90th birthday. So we have we got to celebrate the spirit of the king himself.
Yeah.
Still alive, preaching in a Baptist church.
actually visited Graceland last year. It was great. You really come away thinking, oh, this guy lived the American dream. My gosh, it's great.
There's photos hidden, hopefully, by my mother somewhere of me dressed up as Elvis, very young, through my young years. I worshipped Elvis. It was amazing how effective they were at marketing Elvis compared to anyone else. It was, it was the start. It was the start of it. But anyway, Andy, you have gone deep dive into The Turning. I keep wanting to call it The Quartering. But no, The Turning. At what point did this catch your eye? Did you gravitate towards this? Because you put out how many videos have you put out on the Generation Report?
83 now. 83.
And you're done with it now? You're over?
Well, I'm definitely closer to the finish line than the beginning. How much further I go will depend on a lot of factors, but it's definitely been a long, winding road, or a long, strange trip, to borrow from Jerry Garcia.
All right, let's start from the beginning. How did you come across this?
So when I was about this would have been when I was 28, back in the spring of 2014. I was living back in New England, having come home from living in Washington, D.C. for a time, trying to make it there, and feeling kind of down about myself because of the way my life was going, and lots of things were just not panning out as I expected. And in the course of one of my afternoons, just kind of trying to QWERTY search my way to try to resolve the problems of the world, I came across this blog which had a post about something called Strauss-Howe generational theory. And I kind of went, well, what is this about? I think that's the way a lot of people find it, or they just trip upon it. It's accidental. And initially I was more than skeptical. I was thinking this seems very retrofitted around a predetermined conclusion that things just happen in a fixed order and there's nothing we can do about it. But as I started to read more deeply into it, and I read the explanations that these two historians named William Strauss and Neil Howe gave for why certain moods in history tend to follow others, and especially why the millennial generation is the way it is, I was hooked because I just said, this explains so many things that I've suspected going back to when I was a young kid, that it just gave me a lot of reassurance in knowing that not everything that I had imagined about the way the world was going was my imagination, that I was picking up on something that, the world kind of seemed to be falling apart, and I was young in the middle of it. So that set my interest in it. What ultimately led me to do the podcast was spending about 3 to 4 years of following as much content as I could about it and realizing this conversation doesn't seem to be evolving much. And the people who do engage with it, they tend to repeat the same prefabricated talking points over and over and over. And it seems remarkably incurious. I have a great admiration for Bill Strauss and Neil Howe. Bill Strauss has since passed away. Neil Howe's still alive. He's in his 70s. I do think that he is very much stuck in the mindset of laying the theory out as he did in the 1990s rather than updating it to the present day. So I set out to be the person who would update the present day and make it meaningful for people in view of what's going on in America now.
And we did reach out to him just to see if he'd want to come on the show. It was just yesterday. So, we'll see what happens with that. Just because I did do some research because I wanted to get the idea behind the book, but I also wanted to do a little research on the authors and just sort of whatever feel I could out of them off of YouTube, so as a YouTube warrior I am. And, but I found some interesting clips from them. And it did seem it remind me of the names again. It's Neil Howe. Is that correct?
Neil Howe and William Strauss.
William Strauss. And William Strauss was he he was a politician from Texas? Is that correct?
Well, first I should preface by saying lots of people say Neil Strauss. Neil Strauss, as you may know, I can tell by the reaction. He wrote Neil Strauss was the author of a book called The Game in about 2005 or so. Very different genre. Lots of people have brought that up, and I laugh every time they do it because I've done it myself in the early going.
I wanted to call him Rob Lowe there for a minute. Sort of like a brother of Rob Lowe.
Yeah, but to answer your initial question, Strauss and Howe were both Ivy League educated Washington, D.C. movers and shakers in the 1980s. I don't believe that Neil Howe was working directly for a politician. I think he was more on the consulting side of that city's business community and was working with a lot of people doing entitlements reform. Bill Strauss was working, at least for a time, for somebody who was a congressperson. And when that period of time passed, and knowing a lot of the same people, they started working together and writing together.
Well, it appeared to be sort of like some sort of side project between the two that developed into something much more once they started digging into it. Because, you can date this all the way. It stays true how far back in time, this cyclical theory?
Well, they studied in America going back to the English colonial settlements. And in Anglo history going back to the War of the Roses, I think.
Okay. So, yeah, they because I remember watching one interview on C-SPAN they did, and they talk about this one chart in the book that once they started diving into that chart, it was game over for them. So that's a little interesting history about them. I thought Bill Strauss was sort of more of the salesman of the book, and Neil Howe was more of the brain behind it. I don't know if that's correct. You're the one that's studied this. Is that sort of your feeling on the matter? Or?
In general, yes. I think that having read Neil's recent book, I think that if there's a clear difference between the two, it's that Neil, with his background in economics and in the intelligence field, And as a demographer, I think he's better at breaking reality down into pieces the way demographers do, whereas Bill Strauss was more big picture. We can maybe get to a discussion later of the new book, but that was my takeaway from the new book, that they really had complemented each other well in terms of balancing big picture and details. And I think the new book was more heavy on the details rather than the big picture.
Let's go back to the original book, because this was written or published in 1997.
Yeah.
And I'm going to be honest. I mean, it really makes millennials feel pretty good about ourselves. I listened to about 3 hours worth of interviews between them in 1997 and 98. And it was interesting because that you said that link between millennials and World War II. He mentions in C-SPAN in the interview there. And, you know, I like to call ourselves elder millennials for the piety. So if you want to take that, go ahead. I'm trying to spread it around.
Well, you mentioned something that is a real point of skepticism for people who come across this idea for the first time, which is that when millennials get compared to the GI or greatest generation, people instinctively, especially people who are, I won't say they're all around my parents' age, but a lot of them tend to be, they instinctively kind of go. Hmm. And my response usually is, well, part of the problem with that reaction or with that dismissal is that we haven't really, as I think as a culture, understood exactly what kind of life story the greatest generation had before they became known as the greatest generation. When you actually go back and trace their life story to the very early 20th century when they started being born, whatever year you want to start. 1901 is what Strauss and Howe used. Some people have speculated it could be moved to a later start date. But they came along at a time when there was a very similar transformation going on in the way that people looked at family life, the way that people looked at raising kids and prioritizing giving kids protection, structure, encouraging them to be dutiful and high achieving. All those things that were happening for people around your age and mine in the latter part of the 1980s and in the 1990s, that was happening in a very characteristically similar way in the beginning of the 20th century. And they grew older carrying that same set of characteristic traits and that similar personality outlook with them of being more peer-oriented than wanting to stand out on their own, believing in rationality over spiritualism, science over sort of like the metaphysical. And of course, their generation and ours are different in many essential respects, but as an archetype in history, the similarities are there. And for that reason alone, people should take this theory seriously.
Well, and I let's play around in that area of the similarities before World War II, before World War One. I think he focuses. I didn't really hear him mention World War One as much as he mentions World War II, but World War One would fall under that generation at the very tail end, wouldn't it? Or
well, they would have been kids during World War One.
So the greatest generation is 1925 to 19. Is that correct? I think it's 1925 to 1940.
That's you're talking about the silent generation. The greatest generation was 1901 through 1924.
Yeah, so they still would have been 18 when World War One was getting over. So they would have had the realization of World War One at least in the back of their heads growing up, because especially in the Midwest, I find fascinating growing up. I grew up in Iowa, and the amount of lives lost in the Midwest to World War One. Maybe not as big of a deal to bigger cities on the East Coast, but to rural farming communities that were just beginning to thrive, huge losses. Whole towns just decimated, lost all their boys. So there was a no doubt anyone that survived that probably had that in the back of their mind. And then you had, sort of the rebellious, 1920s generation, followed by the Great Depression, leading into World War II. And so obviously, like you said, history doesn't repeat itself. It rhymes, though. There's definite similarities. And you think about the millennial generation, you have, you got the Cold War in full effect. Russia's military, is right before its breaking point. And then you have that collapse, and we focus onto the Desert Storm in the early 90s. You have Black Hawk Down. And then, of course, the major event 9/11, which happens, right as, the older millennials are hitting teenage years. And then you have a 8-year war in 2 different countries. That's very similar to growing up, during World War I back in the, that's to me, that's it's interesting, at least. What do you make of, when you?
Well, you mentioned 9/11. One of the things that has been a topic of conversation for a long time is, when did the fourth turning begin? I won't get on a long thing about why 2008 is the beginning, but that's, I think, the general consensus now, and it's a consensus I agree with. With respect to 9/11, there was such an interesting period of time after that event happened where maybe you experienced this the same way. It seemed to me that for about the first 6 to 9 months after the attacks, the country was remarkably united, and people put their kind of petty disagreements largely aside. And then as soon as Iraq started to dominate the headlines, it all went away.
Yes.
So my recollection of being, I was 16 at the time 9/11 happened. My recollection is that it was a kind of a precursor to the divisions and the sense of crisis we would have later, because of one singularly traumatic event. But with the whole environment of what was going on through most of the 2000s, before Obama showed up and before the global financial crisis, how it was still very much culture wars, people becoming a little bit more interested in politics, but still largely disengaged from it. There was the snark coming from the Jon Stewarts and the Stephen Colberts of the world about how the Bush administration was running the country was not the same level of just openly pandering to a political audience like we have now. At least that's how I sensed it at the time. And the crucial thing, what ultimately sold to me that this was a third turning event, not a fourth turning starter event, was that in the fourth turning, making the observations about what third turnings in history are like, Strauss and Howe wrote that wars and third turnings are fought with moral fervor, but without consensus or follow through. And I thought, bingo, that's the war on terror for you. Even though obviously it continued for 14, 15 years, it was fought in a characteristically third turning fashion. So 9/11, even though it was a huge event, was a third turning event, not a fourth turning event.
Yeah, that's so. 2001. It adds fuel to the fames of what is the actually. I've got a clip if you don't mind me playing it.
Sure.
It was done in 1997. It's Neil and William there getting interviewed. Give me a second here, because I'm by far just a one-man operation here. But,
25 years ago, Bill Strauss and I proposed that modern history, and certainly American history, runs in these long cycles of 80 or 90 years, which we call saecula. And each of these is divided into generation-length units that we call turnings. So each saeculum has 4 turnings or 4 seasons. And we suggested at that time that America, this was in the late Clinton years, was in the 3rd turning of the fall season. And we predicted that ultimately, certainly by the 2020s, we'd be in the winter season, the 4th turning. Here we are. And that's why I wrote this book, The 4th Turning.
I'm sorry, that's not the right video, but I thought we'd let it play through here, because that is Neil Howe talking about his new release there. And you have some, I can see you're chomping at the bit here to go to go into your argument on here about Neil Howe. Do you have any disagreements with the original book?
Well, in principle, not
fascinating
really.
fact about this book.
I'm sorry.
I would say that most of my issues with Strauss and Howe's predictions and their analysis has to do with things that they expected millennials to do and who they expected millennials to come based upon previous hero archetypes in history. One of many examples. Sorry, getting a little bit of ringing in my ear.
Are you?
One example. It's
Give me a
still
second.
going.
I got to. Sorry about that. Is
this good? Okay. So my disagreement with Neil, and I'm more generous in how I assess the disagreement now than I perhaps was a few years ago. But there's just certain things that if you're a millennial like you and I are, you know certain things about our lived experience that even the greatest generational experts in the world could not possibly know. And I think that's true of any generation. There's certain things about being, coming along when my parents did that I don't know anything about because that's just not my experience. And I think that there are lots of examples, especially in a book that they wrote about millennials called Millennials Rising, which came out in 2000, where they very optimistically predicted that millennials would move the country in a certain direction and be super constructive, super upbeat, and super, collegial and together in almost like a kumbaya fashion to address and redress the country's problems and sort of, curb all the boomers' excesses. It was based upon, I think, a very rosy picture of their own parents' generation and what they had done and the responsibility that the greatest generation or the GIs had for singularly moving America in a better direction during the 30s and 40s. They expected millennials to do the same thing in our era. And what that has taught me is that, this theory, it's definitely easy to get pulled into it and to, suddenly think it explains everything. It does not explain everything. And you have to be careful, even me, I have to be careful in not attributing things to generational differences or generational contributions that don't deserve to be given attribution. In other words, history is a lot more than a demographic puzzle. It's a lot more than the sum of just generational change. And I think that, especially in Neil's new book, I think that he forgot that sometimes.
What do you, I guess, when you look at the pros and cons of what this, the original book has provided for, as far as just understanding a weird pattern that has happened do you believe that this is an actual thing, or do you think it's it shouldn't be, it's not an exact science, it's more of a guide. As to
Well,
the-
it's definitely a guide. It can never be proven completely scientific. At the same time, I think the urgency that it needs to be, people need to understand that this set of ideas, because they've been proven right about enough big picture things, especially, this set of ideas really needs to be taken seriously because of the implication of what this means for the future. I mean, it's great to sort of break down generational differences and say, well, oh, this explains why millennials are different than Xers and Xers from boomers, and why today's kids might be different than millennials. All that's fine and good. For me, the biggest thing is what's the country going to be like in 10 years? If you just go back to the Great Depression or World War II, or to pick a specific time, the Great Depression, nobody could have imagined what this country was going to go through in World War II in 1935, 36. People expected there to be another world war. They did not think that 60 million people around the world, give or take, would die, and that all of American society would be retooled and repurposed to achieve total victory. They did not see that happening, and yet that's precisely what happened. A similar kind of transformation marked the prior crises, and when you stop and consider what that means, we're approaching something like that again. Everybody's life is going to change in a very dramatic way based upon how the next 8 to 10 years unfold, starting next week with the inauguration. But the resistance is already underway, and so it's going to get a lot more intense out there. And once people understand that this pattern in history has substance to it, it's not just theoretical, they can at least map their own lives a little bit better and not completely lose hope if they have a bad day or something bad happens in the news.
Let's dive into. I want to get your take on some of these charts, and I just sort of want to play along so people get an idea of what the original book had to say. Just let me know if you can hear the audio or not. I'm going to play a little bit of it here, and this I believe this is William talking. I did think this was interesting when he was talking about the greatest generation, as we know them, about the term senior citizen.
Yeah, it was funny is so I was born in 1985. Both of my parents are boomers. Both of their sets of parents were young during World War II. I had a relationship growing up with just one of my 4 grandparents, and it turns out I didn't know this until I got into this theory, she was actually a silent, not a GI. But what I noticed about some of the GI relatives that I have in my family was that they were, I wouldn't say they were worlds apart personality-wise, but they were definitely somewhat different than at least how I perceived my grandmother. My grandmother was empathic. One of her favorite saying was it takes all kinds, sort of, different strokes for different folks kind of philosophy about life. And she was just known for being very, very kind to people, everybody who knew her. And the greatest generation, by contrast, when they were old, they were known for being physically and kind of emotionally distant from younger people to a very considerable degree. And I even saw that in my own family. So like a lot of people, when I first got into this theory, I didn't really think through the differences of what made for who was the silent generation and who were the GIs or the greatest. But one of the real valuable things that getting into this stuff allows you to do is, like millennials like myself, I understand my grandparents better now. And I understand also that the people who, profess to be generational experts, or put out a chart of generations, and everybody older than a boomer is called a traditionalist. You need to disregard those people and what they say immediately, because all older people have not, in American history and recent American history, have not always been this kind of fixed set of personality characteristics where they're living with other people in their 70s and 80s in kind of leisure city type condominiums. They're a distinct personality type. And back to your original point about senior citizens, the GI generation coined that term because the people who came before them had not had the same kind of formative experience young of banding together as a group and saving the country in its time of need. So I never thought through when I was young what that term, what that designation really meant. But it was very much coined for and is now associated with one particular group of people. And I think that's very, very important to keep in mind.
It's fascinating. Could you hear that clip at all?
I think I only heard a little bit of the muffled background, but I've seen it before.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
So that's what he was talking about, that in that clip, about that's where that term comes from, senior citizen. What a beautiful little gem to have, I had a unique experience. My dad was a minister, and he visited a lot of elderly World War II vets in the nursing homes, or in their old age, and he would take me along under the rules that I not utter a word unless I was spoken to. And I got to hear amazing stories from people that had just seen been in Normandy, had been fighting in the Pacific front there, and a lot of times, just because of who my dad was, they told him everything, because they wanted it off their chest. I was just 8 years old, sitting there with my eyes wide open, and it, like the trauma they went through, which it was, you can't get away from saying that, there's trauma when there's war involved, but the resolve they showed afterwards to turn it into as much good as possible. Even the fact that they rebuilt all of Europe, they paid to rebuild all of Europe. That was that generation as well too. It's quite amazing. This chart here, let me see here, pull it back up. That they show, pull you away here. So we've got the missionary, the lost generation, the GI, which we consider the greatest generation. The silent generation comes after them. The boomer generation, the 13th generation, which that was new. I had never heard that before.
This was a quick point about that. This book, I believe it was published about 6 months to a year before the book came out that kind of gave Generation X its name, which that's actually a whole rabbit hole unto itself, as to why we have all these generations given letters for names now.
Yes,
but they kind of rode that label into the ground a little bit. So here's an interesting, here's a little bit of background about the letter phenomenon with generations. So my understanding is that the term Generation X first appeared in Britain in the 1960s. It was one of these labels that was thrown around trying to describe the mod teenagers and young adults who were hanging around London and the other big cities in Britain in the mid 60s. That label later got picked up in one of Billy Idol's early bands. One of his early bands was called Generation X. Much later, sometime in mid to late 1991, there was a Canadian novelist named Doug Coupland who put out a book called Generation X, which exactly the story drive, I'm not certain what it was, but basically the premise was about, telling a story of him and his friends as people who were sort of underemployed, kind of aimless 20-somethings in Canada who were told by the culture and demographers in Canada and the US that they were boomers, but who didn't feel like it. That ultimately led to the label picking up a little bit of traction on both sides of the Canadian-US border. And then the very next year, the movie X came out with Denzel Washington. And then the letter was everywhere. The merchandise was everywhere. And by about early 1993, which is important for a reason I'll mention in a moment, early 1993 is when Gen X became the consensus name for people born between the boomers and the millennials. What often happens once a generational label is settled on and a sort of personality sketch of who they are is basically finished, that's when the rush to label the next generation begins in earnest. And sometime, I think it was in the summer of 1993, was the very first time millennials got tagged with the name Generation Y. It was in an article, I believe, in Advertising Age. As I think you probably remember, and many people who may be listening who are about our age remember, that label was used for us for a very long time. It ultimately didn't stick, at least not as much as millennial did, but it is still sometimes used to refer to us. And that in turn is what gave rise to Generation Z in about 2014 or 2015, which not coincidentally happened when there was this millennial fatigue setting in the media, just like the Generation X fatigue that set in the early 90s. So you go from this long road of how Generation X got its name to suddenly the media and demographers were like, oh, we can use letters to just slap these, new, to just apply to people so that, they're going to be easy to identify from now on. And now it's just gotten out of control. Some people are saying that the generation after Gen Z is Gen Alpha, and you hear people talk about Gen Beta. It's gone completely off the rails, but it all started about 60 years ago, which is crazy.
That's an interesting little side quest there on the naming of these generations. Who is they? Like, who is there a generational report that comes out, or is it just one guy that they keep throwing stuff at the media and see what sticks? Or
I think the media and the social sciences, the media especially, understand that generational stories are great clickbait. They're like junk food. People open them, they read them, even if it's like a paragraph or two, and it's either reaffirming to them or it knocks, some group of younger people that drives them crazy at work in a way that makes them feel puffed up, and then they move on with their day. But nobody really learns anything. I think that cycle has just gained its own momentum and become something that is just it's just part of the landscape now. But it's been allowed to become that because we kind of think that in this cultural moment we live in now, where we all identify ourselves before the rest of the world can define us, everybody's in a rush to identify the generation they belong to, and it just creates this.
Well, we live in a
mess.
world. It's like everything's based off of your identity. You know, we were watching. Me and my girlfriend, we were watching a show where the person had to bring up their identity. I think they brought it up 13 times within 4 sentences. And I looked at her and I'm like, I don't need. It just amazes me. It's sort of sad because, you know, if that's the only, well, we can go down that wormhole some other day, but these identifiers that people, you know, they build their character off of these identifiers, but these identifiers are who's giving them out, who's, you know, who's making you feel good about your generation. You know, it's just very interesting. And that's what's the beauty of this book, I feel like, is that, you know, we've got a set time, 1997 it was published, you know, and we can just sort of, it's a good little baseline to sort of see how the cycle ebbs and flows. Because one thing about America, and every economy, is that there is a ebb and flow. Have they tried this, or have other people tried to apply this theory to other countries, or is this uniquely American?
I think it's, well, first I should say I have not done extensive research into the generations in countries besides the U.S. So I cannot, I don't have the authority to say definitively the exact same birth years that apply and the archetypes that apply in America apply elsewhere exactly the same or more or less the same. I do think that there is a certain resemblance in the types of generations and a close alignment in the birth years for the most part around the world, at least around the countries that were involved in World War II in some way. People in Canada who have done dives into this is my understanding, that the belief is that the Canadian and American generational cycles, including the archetypes, overlap or line up pretty well going back to about the time of the American Revolution, which I think is interesting because that was about 200 years before Canada was finally out of the Commonwealth system. So this pattern is something that has a worldwide dimension, which tells you, or at least it tells me, is that it's about human nature. That there is something deeply embedded in human nature where certain kind of social changes happen on a more or less predictable schedule because the human experience and the way societies evolve, it's a byproduct of human social instincts and human biology, and those two things don't deviate very much. You know, so it's a long way of saying the actual application of the birth years and what they mean for the specific groups in the years themselves, that's an American thing, but the actual phenomenon is more worldwide.
What do you mean birth years? What are birth years?
So, well, just the span of years when, like, for example, the Boomer generation was born, according to Strauss and Howe, from 1943 to 1960. There's a lot of reasons. Most people have been hearing their whole lives, including Boomers, have been hearing that they were born from 46 to 64. If you buy into the Strauss-Howe framework, that's actually wrong. They were actually born earlier. Because people born 43, 44, and 45, while they were born during World War II, were too young to personally remember it before it was over. And if you actually look at the list of famous people born in those years, they're clearly boomers. Like, they just are. And that same logic can be used to map out which birth years belong to which generations, certainly in the 20th century generations, if not going back before that.
Okay, so those are the baseline years then, which is interesting. So I was I was sort of curious because I remember I had worked for an insurance company years ago, and they were, of course, licking their chops at the millennial generation because it it will surpass the boomer generation. And I looked it up, and it didn't quite do that. But as of 2019, there are more millennials than there are boomers, which is just sort of amazing to me that poor Generation 13 or X. I sort of want to call them 13 just to spite them. But Generation X, they're sort of similar to the silent generation.
Well, they're similar in the way they get overlooked. See, what's interesting about the way that Strauss and Howe have talked about the archetypes of the generations from the beginning is they make the point that the type of generation that boomers are and the type of generation that millennials are, and millennials being the same type of generation as the greatest generation, this confirms what I'm about to say next, which is there are dominant and recessive generation types. And it's not that the greatest generation and boomers have had a demonstrably greater impact on history than the silent and Generation X. It's that they were, there's two things I think that are at work here. One is they were entering young adulthood at one of history's critical turning points in all cases. The dominant type generations reach young adulthood during awakenings and during crises. The recessive type generations age into young adulthood at different times when there's not as much social or political turmoil going on, and they also don't have the same center of gravity where they all feel like they're part of a generation. And that's something that distinguishes millennials certainly from Generation X. I don't want to speak for anybody else who might be listening, but for me, even though I didn't so much consciously think about generations when I was growing up, I knew that myself and my friends and people my age, we had certain things in common. We had a certain outlook in common that I didn't quite perceive the same way in people a little bit older than me. And that's something that I think millennial type generations and boomer type generations have that other generations don't.
When we talk about because it's 4 different seasons. It's the easiest way for me to remember it in my brain. So the first season is called what?
Well, the seasons are first, second, and third, fourth turnings, obviously in that order. The first season Strauss and Howe call a high, which is an era when there's a lot of social stability and support for strong institutions, and there's a great sense of national direction and a belief in a common future. There's also a lot of cultural conformity, as critics of the 1950s have been mentioning since that time. That's when the silent generation was coming of age. And the silent generation is a very particular archetype in history called the artist. These are people who are, and I'm painting broad brushstrokes here, but the broad brushstrokes do matter. Artist archetypes are very well-mannered, have a reputation as being kind, empathic, sensitive, indecisive, don't produce a lot of strong leaders, but produce a lot of people who are highly expert in what they do, and people who, especially when they're old, are known for their great kindness to younger people, much like my grandmother was. And this is something that has been seen going back all through American history. The generation that was growing old during the 1920s, the progressive generation was like this. They were an artist archetype. The compromiser generation that was growing old before the Civil War was an artist archetype. And today's kids, those who were born after millennials, are also an artist archetype. And they will, like the silent generation, start to come of age when we go into the next first turning. I can run through the whole list of the turnings if you want.
Yeah, yes, let's go through them.
So famously, I mentioned the boomers a moment ago. Second turnings, Strauss and Howe call awakenings. And these are the eras like, and I should just add too, that the last high in America was the immediate post-World War II era that ran up until the assassination of President Kennedy. The second turning was the era that followed the assassination of President Kennedy, running through about the early Ronald Reagan years before the Morning in America boom. And in that intervening 20 years, there was an enormous cultural upheaval that took all kinds of shapes and forms. Lots of lifestyle experimentation, lots of people throwing responsibility to the winds, lots of people self-immersing. And this is when boomers were coming of age. Generations like boomers, they're called the prophet archetype by Strauss and Howe because over the course of their life, and this is something that people have observed going back to antiquity, to biblical times, that generations that are like boomers that are born after one great history-shaking big crisis, they know only the safety, security, and relative quiet and peace of the immediate post-crisis period, and they see the institutions dominated by older people as essentially morally deficient in moral worth. I think it is a phrase that Strauss and Howe used a lot. And so when they come of age, they want to rebel and they want to make a lot of noise and they want to live by different standards, especially internally felt standards than older people, especially than their parents.
Is it more of a focus on individuality?
Yes.
Boomers, they want to, and that's the, okay, that's the second stage, right?
And that's the second turning. It's called an awakening.
The awakening. So it's high, awakening. Those are the first two. Okay.
And the turning after that is called the unraveling. This is the third turning. And these are basically eras when the cultural forces that are set loose during awakenings reach a state of kind of peak individuation, and people scatter far apart. People grow very moralistic and very cynical. There's a lot of people just kind of, I don't know if a lot of people had the same experience with the 1990s that I did, but one of the things that still stands out to me about growing up as a kid during that time is how little passive aggressiveness there was in comparison to the years that I've lived out my adulthood. When I was a kid, if people didn't like you, they just told it to your face. It was a time when people were just very blunt with each other, and there was a sense of kind of everybody's in it for themselves. That was part of the larger cultural trend of, everybody looking out for number one, just do it. Was a slogan for everything.
Political correctness, it felt like to me like political correctness sort of became a thing in the late 2000s, early 2010s, where we started to really notice how words were very measured and all of that while being extremely passive aggressive, and I remember that in the 90s it was, and that had it. I would think the introduction with internet and smartphones, do you feel like that has sped up any of this in any process?
In a way, yes. I do think it's interesting, though. I was thinking about this earlier today because I saw, of course, that Mark Zuckerberg just talked to Joe Rogan.
Yeah.
and he made the point about how it's been a long time since Apple came out with anything really new and innovative. And I started thinking about it. I said, well, wait a minute. Okay, so this era we're living in now began in 2008. Steve Jobs died in 2011, but the iPhone came out in 2007, and most of the devices that Apple released after the iPhone, I'm pretty sure almost all of them, certainly the most successful ones, were in development when the iPhone was issued for the first time.
Nothing changed. just improved the characteristics within the creation itself.
Yes, and I think that says something very important about the conception of that technology was born of a different mindset than what has existed in the age of woke.
I'll give you an example since we're going down a gamer example. We played Madden growing up on our Xbox, and once they came out with online play, you could play 3 guys versus 3 guys online. And I mean, you could bet on the games, you could do all sorts of ornery stuff, uh, and uh, and you could create leagues and have these huge leagues with a bunch of different teams in them. Just great, great features. And this would have been probably at the height of that game, 2012, and after 2013, they slowly, and this wasn't just Madden, but Madden's the example I use. They slowly started taking all these features away. And I just saw a thing pop up that the modern day Madden game has like 17 different features compared to the 2012, which had 278. And and it's sort of plays a long line with all of technology. Just sort of it, it built up to a point where it was like great, and I would say around that 2011 2012 range where it maybe climaxed, and then you haven't seen any advancement. I mean, we've been working with VR headsets for 30 years. All these different examples. Is that a sign of a change in the season then?
Possibly, I think that I think what it says as much as anything is that in the era that you and I remember when these games were coming out and they were, really moving the needle like this, they were the people developing them were just developing them because they love video games. And from about the time the woke movements really broke out around 2013 to 2014 or so, everybody's trying to make a statement, and that puts people off. And for some reason, I was thinking about this the other day. There's so much conversation about the NBA now, and the NBA's ratings are not what they used to be. It's I don't think it's as appreciated as it used to be. That I think the NFL's all-time peak of ratings was around 2015 or so, which is before some of the woke politics got into pro football. So these kinds of trends of, once the political points of view start seeping into places where people just expected them to not be before, it starts changing the incentive of the people who are developing something or marketing something or consuming something. But there's also a block of people who just get off put by it and who don't come back.
Well, and like you said, there's overall signs. Obviously, the fourth turning, or the turnings, didn't predict the fall of gaming, but it's not just gaming. It's the automobile industry. It's all of these different, the graphics cards, all of these different technological advances. And we grew up in the 90s, and we were probably the last ones to get full Americana propaganda put in front of us. I remember seeing the old cartoons with Paul Revere and Bugs Bunny talking about the Japanese. And I remember all of those cartoons growing up, and be like, well, uh and I think it's interesting that when technology was coming out, in my mind, when I was 8, when I was 10, I just thought, man, where are we going to be by the time I'm 30, 35? And I thought self-driving cars was probably the least exciting thing. and we barely have that. We barely have that. Like, it's sort of interesting how quickly it slowed down. So you've got the high, and then you've got the awakening, which is sort of like the Renaissance era of the turning, right? A lot of the arts, the
what's funny is I'm trying to go back to my reading of the book from some time ago. I think that Strauss and Howe locate the Renaissance maybe as a first turning, sort of like the Enlightenment.
Okay.
I could be wrong about that. But you're basically right that it was very heavily influenced by a lot of artistic creativity, certainly from younger people. That the 1950s and early 60s have, I think, unfairly gotten a reputation as a time when there was no cultural creativity. It just wasn't as dynamic or as in your face as what came once, the Beatles landed in New York, and you had, Woodstock some years later, and, all the stuff in art and music and lifestyle experimentation that happened in the 60s and 70s. It was so culture shifting that it made the prior era seem small in comparison, but there was a lot of cultural creativity in the 1950s and early 60s too. And maybe that, if that explains the analogy to the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, it's that there was more cultural creativity than is generally believed.
Well, it would make sense that their kids then would be the ones that would be accepting of all these different cultures and willing to, experiment with all these different ideals as well. So you've got the high, you've got the awakening, and then you've got the unraveling, and then the fourth turning is
the crisis, which is where we've been since 2008. And there's a lot of ways you could break down why things began in 2008. For me personally, it's actually a very personal thing because I graduated from college that year. And the change was enormous. But in terms of the political climate in the country,
what was your personal change? You say it was enormous.
Oh, well, I was kind of in a strange personal situation after I graduated that spring, where I thought I was going to go overseas on a short-term work visa. And just as was happening in this country, the jobs that I was applying for overseas, or that I was looking for, were drying up so fast that I just couldn't land something. And then I landed a rather thankless job, but a job that I was thinking would hold me over that fall. And 2 weeks later, the huge economic dip hit. And that just kind of set my young adulthood in motion in a way that I never saw coming. I was totally blindsided by everything that happened. But in terms of moving from the personal to sort of the general political, is, as I was saying before, during my years in college, there was conversation about politics, but it was mostly relegated to being on a campus and thinking that the people running the country were idiots, and satisfying yourself at night by watching Colbert and Stewart.
Yes,
Stewart first and Colbert second. And, being smug in the belief that you were smarter than the people in charge. But that wasn't the same as the wave that hit when Obama hit. I've told a number of people this story, that when the weekend that I was graduating, there was something came up with a school in Connecticut where their graduation speaker had to cancel, and Barack Obama filled in at the last minute for whoever was scheduled and took ill. And I knew somebody who was at this particular school, and the envy that we had for this person was absolutely out of control. Because he was the Messiah. That's the way that he was presented. That's the belief that had caught on with a lot of politically interested people my age and people younger than me. That was a moment in time, and within
let me play around with that too, because I was coming out of I was 21, and I had just come out of a religious cult that I had been raised in my entire life, and I had worked up in the headquarters in New York, and left the cult, but they did not allow us to be involved with politics. We couldn't vote, couldn't do anything politically motivated. And so at a very young age, I would like listen to political talk shows in the basement and like read the politics sections in the newspaper. Just because it was the thing I wasn't supposed to do. But I got, sucked in during the invasion of Iraq, because I remember people calling it a holy war, and there was a lot of people from Iowa that were getting sent out there, and they were coming back pretty rough from Afghanistan. And now we were going to Iraq, and they were going over there, and a lot of stuff wasn't adding up. And then came the Daily Show, and it was, Jon Stewart was smart, witty, made you, like you said, that feeling of Bush is just, Bush helped himself to being an idiot, but his policies, he knew what he was doing over there, as is evident looking back now. But we were, we were led into that war in 2004. And I remember Colin Powell, and I don't know if you remember this at all, but I remember watching the UN meeting where he's holding up the yellow cake. And he's like, yeah, did yellow cake right here. And I remember thinking, wow, that's what we're going to war for, And then we went to war for it after they told us no. They told us no, and we said, all right, we'll just do it ourselves. And from that point on, I remember a lot of people feeling, even in the Midwest, there was this split feeling where it was like, I thought we were taking care of 9/11, and now we're in a completely different country where nothing from 9/11 happened. And you see this shift. And then, of course, Michael Moore came out with Fahrenheit 9/11, which exposed all the money connections the Bush family had and the benefits they were getting from that war. And then, of course, you had the Daily, attack by Jon Stewart, and then later by Stephen Colbert. And then Bush's reaction to being attacked by the media was just to pretend he never had heard it. And just, that was literally his theory. You go and clips and find him in interviews saying, I just, don't acknowledge it. I will never acknowledge it. Yep. And then you had someone like Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton, and they were both fighting for the Democrat Party to get the president nod to go up against McCain. And Barack, man, he came in, he said, change. We're going to get out of these wars. We're going to focus on taking care of our people here. And that's sort of where that realm of political correctness came from, because nothing anyone said to him ruffled his feathers. He was just he was a smooth talker, and then he went on the Daily Show. He went on Comedy Central to talk to Jon Stewart, which no politician had ever done. And at 21 years old, man, that's a good argument, to go vote for the guy. And like, I'm glad I didn't, deep down. But it was my first year out of the cult. And I said, well, I better wait, because I could be getting sucked into something I don't know. And that's exactly what it was, and
it's so interesting looking back that there was there was no alternate media, at least not to the extent that there is now, who could really pick apart the mainstream media's monopoly on the Barack Obama narrative. I don't get overtly into politics too much, but I will just be upfront about it here. I voted for Obama twice. And what I've learned about him, or think I've learned about him since then, I have a very different view of him now.
Well, it's sad because you didn't support the person that you learned about. You supported the ideals that he knew you would support, and he played on a group of millennials who were coming to age to vote, and I think it's, in the end, it's a good sign, because all those millennials just wanted peace. And I think eventually we're going to get there, because that's always been the overall consensus. It's just, no one taught us really about politics. So, we've got this like 20-year learning window we have to go through before we figure out what's going on.
And millennials weren't really concerned about the economy in 2008. Even some of the people around my age and a little bit older who may have lost their jobs in the Great Recession, there was still the feeling, well, this is a blip and I'll get myself back on track after I just work hard and land another job after sending out another 100 resumes, or I'll go back to school and get a fancy degree, or I'll just patch my life together for a little while, but it's going to be fine. In that context, Obama's incredible gift for rhetoric, and how that rhetoric fit with the conditioning that we've been given all the way up through our life and by a lot of our educations, the sync between the two was so great, and he was so skillful at pulling that off that he convinced us that he was on our side. Again, a little bit of a different feel for who he was now that I'm older.
And the beauty of, I think, this conversation is our ability to analyze what happens and adjust, forward. And I think that's a good sign for most millennials, not getting entrenched in one way or the other. I mean, there's plenty of that, but there's also a lot of open-mindedness among millennials. So you're saying, what part of the turning are we in now? Because each turn.
We are in the fourth turning. This is the crisis.
Oh, good. Yeah, that's right.
And what's significant about 2008 from the standpoint of politics, besides the obvious, the rise of the savior, was whether it's the Tea Party movement, the Occupy movement, the broader woke movement, Black Lives Matter, Make America Great Again. None of these slogans, none of these movements were around before 2008. And to try to draw out parallels to all those things before the Great Recession and the rise of Obama, I'm not saying that there weren't any movements at all, or there weren't any protests at all. There certainly were protests, especially against the Iraq War, but it was different. It was more diffuse, and it wasn't as organized, and it wasn't as pitched with the sense of, oh my God, the country's going off a cliff, and my life may potentially, and livelihood may potentially go with it. But after 2008, it was different. And that's why I think of the fourth turning as beginning then. And just to quickly wrap up what fourth turnings in history are, they're the eras. These are about 20 or so year-long eras, give or take, when civic cohesion and social trust, at least initially, go into steep decline. Political and economic institutions essentially start to die, or they start to wither away in terms of their efficacy in doing what they're supposed to do. And the very survival of society feels at stake. And I don't think it's a hard sell to most people that that's the mode we've been in for a long time now.
We just covered on our last show, we're sort of digging into what the PSYOP message for this year campaign is for the United States, and we played that clip. I forget the actress's name of Homeland on the Colbert Report, or I'm not Colbert Report. I'm not. That was a flashback. The Late Show he does now. Yeah, and talking about how the producer, the guy who created Homeland, his dad was in the CIA. His brother is high end on the CIA, and every year they have a picnic in Virginia with like the top spooks to talk about what their little plan is. And this year, and this isn't just her. We've uncovered this on the Sean Ryan with his former CIA buddy that likes to come on, Sarah, I forget her name. She's talking about it. It's all the same theme this year. It's about restoring trust in American institutions. And you're saying that that's sort of eventually somehow there's going to be a restoration of this trust.
Well, we would hope there would be one. Certainly, I think within the partisan sides, we're seeing that. Between the two sides, that's where I think Neil Howe and Bill Strauss too, but especially Neil, because he's had the opportunity to assess the last 16, 17 years on his own, where I think he underestimates just one, how deep the divide in the country today really is, and what it means for the future that we haven't seen the kind of turnabout in social trust and just the social entropy or social decline reversing course like we saw in the 30s and like we may have seen in a different way in previous crises. We just haven't seen that this time, and it's made worse by the fact that we just have so many incompetent leaders now, as evidenced by what's happening in California, that the political aftershocks of that event in particular are going to be immense. And there needs to be a lot more rebuilding of social trust over the rest of this era that we're in, which is probably going to last somewhere between another 7 and 10 years. A lot more rebuilding of social trust has to happen before it catches up to where Strauss and Howe predicted it would be at this time.
I want to go back to that, but we do have a question here from Chris May. Any benefits coming from the time that we're in crisis time?
Well, I think definitely that is that you, I think like lots of people, and you don't have to necessarily know we're in a fourth turning to do this. It's almost like somebody is, people just use their intuition to know, that the world around them is kind of going crazy and they need to return to the fundamentals. And the great thing about points in time like the one we're living through is that I do see throughout my own life people making a much more concerted effort to connect with family, close friends, people that they may not have known before, but who have the same concern about what's happening in the country or in their town or in their area, and forming relationships based upon immediate concerns and rebuilding trust, because the world outside of your immediate kin networks is pretty crazy, and so you have to know who you can trust and who you can't. I think that as crazy as the time we're living through is, and as it's going to continue to be, that process is building, at least among like-minded partisans. And that's a big caveat, but it's what we got. That as long as we keep moving through this era, that sense of community with people who want to see community, that will keep sustaining and keep building, even if it doesn't cross partisan lines.
Well, and we talk about a restoration of institutions, but we're not saying a restoration of the same institutions. I mean, institutions can change according to, this theory. It just talks about in general, there's a restoration of institutions.
Right. I think that I think that Strauss and Howe went a little bit too far in expecting that there would be this huge new architecture of like government bureaus and new entitlements and all these other things that resembled what we got in the New Deal, especially during the New Deal in the 30s, that would come again in this era, and it would completely change the institutional face of the country, in particular in the federal government in Washington, D.C. Obviously, the new administration is going to bring a lot of new faces and new attitudes about what the government should do and what it shouldn't do. I think that is going, certainly for the next 4 years, is going to be the dominant feature of what happens in Washington. You're not going to see a lot of new big government edifices being constructed and being staffed. You're going to see a lot of things downsize, or at least come under consideration for being emphasized in service to the idea that freedom and a certain amount of liberty needs to be returned to the American people. I hope that's what happens. But that's a little bit of a different, it fits the fourth turning idea of institutions being directed for new civic purposes, but it doesn't fit the definition of building as I think Strauss and Howe wrote about it or conceived of it.
What do you mean about the building? Like, what do you mean building?
Well, there were so many things that were, there was a time in my life when I lived in, I lived in Washington, D.C. for a little while, and there were times when I would just take a walk from my apartment and go 2 or 3 miles toward the Capitol and see buildings that had, dates from 1935 or 36 or 37 on them, and had these, bureaucratic, letterhead over the doors into the buildings. And I had never heard of the bureaus that were named on the face of the buildings, but I immediately got a sense from the scale of what was there. So, oh, wow. The number of people who came here to essentially be administrators and bureaucrats in this hugely expanded federal government was massive. And obviously that's the 1930s is when the FBI started. It's, I can't remember when the OSS, the precursor to the CIA, began. It might've been in the early 40s.
I believe it was like 47. No, it would have been sooner, I think, because it was been during World War II. They carried over and switched over.
But there were obviously a lot of other alphabets, what they call the alphabet soup agencies under FDR that came along. All of these things completely changed the face, not just the face of how many people worked for the federal government, but what the federal government essentially did was completely retooled and reconfigured, and in a sense, I would argue, rebuilt by the changes of the New Deal. If you go back and you read The Fourth Turning, you can see that Strauss and Howe basically predicted that we would see something like that again, not just the country undergoing a crisis and government assuming new powers, but whole new edifices, and probably in the federal government being constructed for whatever civic purposes or urgent needs would arise. And I think what we've learned, especially since Donald Trump won the popular vote, is that there's a sizable, and won 31 states, is that there's a sizable portion of the country now that is really fed up with this idea that, everything is going to be handed down from Washington, D.C. in terms of determining, how the country proceeds on almost every front you can name. And that's different from before.
Your observation with religion and its ties in with the different turnings, do you see rises and declines of people's affiliation to religion synced up with these? Is that something you've ever looked into?
I haven't looked into it. I do see in my everyday life, and I have picked up through friends, the idea that just in the face of how worried they are about the state of the world or the state of their family, that they're re-engaging and recommitting to their religious faith. I'm I'm doing that in I would say, a much smaller and more modest way. As far as whether it's happening across the rest of the population, I can't really say. My gut instinct tells me that there is a sizable portion of the country that is not going that direction. But among the people who are, I guess, inclined to be religiously observant and who take pride in their religious affiliation, they are re-engaging with it. So in a way, it's kind of another way the country is dividing itself.
In the first stage, the high point, right? I appreciate you being patient with me with these questions. But in the first stage, this is the generation you talk about where there's the art, the culture, the Renaissance ties in more with the first stage of the first turning. So,
well, I guess I guess I should be more precise about how I see the confluence of things that happen during highs. The reason that the post World War II era is thought of as stifling, conformist, subduing of individual creativity is because the people who were individually creative and innovative during that time, a lot of them were working outside the system. And what changed with the second turning was that rather than, this is especially true in civil rights, whereas in the 1950s and early 60s, you had a lot of people who were in the civil rights movement across the movement talking about making America better, making the system better. Almost as soon as the awakening really sprung up in a big way in 1964, you had people like Malcolm X, you had a little bit later the Black Panthers, and you had other groups who were just saying, we want no part of the system at all. And at the very same time, the culture went from, like Miles Davis and John Coltrane, or the folk revival movements of the high. The music became louder, it became angrier, and I love a lot of that music, but it's born of it's reflecting a totally different sensibility of defying authority, defying convention, defying, in certain cases, the government. Whereas in the early 1960s and the years just prior, the people who were dissatisfied with things as they were more, quiet's not the right word, but they were more subtle in the way that they went about it. And that kind of gave the different levels of culture and creativity in the two eras a very different feel.
So with Neil's new book, what is your, I guess, biggest argument against it right now?
Basically, what I was hoping for is that, well, first I should preface by saying I could not imagine being in the position that he was in over so many years to deal with so many. I can't even imagine how many requests he must have dealt with of, when are you coming out with a new book? Just everywhere he went, if people recognized him, I feel like people badgered him with that question.
Seems like after he did his introductory interviews, his obligatory interviews, he just sort of, I couldn't find a lot of in between interviews until recently. And I thought that was interesting, and I also admired that too, because he wrote in his book, he's got predictions. Just, you got to sit back at some point and just, let it sort of sit in people's minds and cultivate.
Yeah. And I think that he had a chance to, especially because the second book came out 26 years after the first, he had a chance to still maintain that he is the person who brought this theory forward, this whole set of ideas into being, and also say, well, where can this be improved? What have we learned based upon the interceding 26 years between, my assessment now and mine and Bill's assessment in the 90s? And I felt that he, instead of doing that, piggybacked on a more or less set in stone idea of what the theory is from the 90s and just retrofitted 26 years of events, but especially recent events, into that original conception of the theory. And I thought that was a mistake because, there have been things that I've said in the course of, assessing his ideas and assessing, what the theory means. There have been things that I predicted that haven't come to pass. There have been things that there have been angles that I've taken in analyses I've done about certain things that I would not do the same way today. And I just felt that he was, by staying in the same lane that he was in when he wrote the original books, I thought that he was more trying to, I thought he seemed very risk averse. And I thought that he seemed not as curious as I hoped he would have been. In that sense, I thought the book was a little underwhelming.
It does seem like in the scientific, and I'm just a layman observing in, but within the certain fields of the scientific community, there is this complacency that there's not a lot of drive to push forward or adapt. Once you found your thing, you just sort of ride on that. Like Neil deGrasse Tyson. I mean, how long has he been riding on the same thing? And but that Bill Nye the Science Guy, for Christ's sake, since the 90s. So and that is sort of what happens to our scientific community here. Is like Albert Einstein, same thing. The standard set. You come up with a pretty good theory, and then you better not adjust it for dear sake that people pick you apart in your field. And I think that's sort of sad. There's no but that is the beauty of YouTube, though, which I think is people it's underwhelming, but it people that dive into these things, it's so well researched now because you have done your section of research of 83 videos. I've watched other people discuss this and 100 some videos, and it and all these different perspectives finding their tie-ins, and it's actually very fascinating that this community seems to just sort of keep growing and growing too. Have you what have you noticed, like, since you started, like, did you just start researching it and start doing just publishing your research on YouTube, or did you, how far
I started back in 2014, and there was a period of several years where I was just there's certain close friends of mine, as well as my parents, who will definitely vouch for. I can't even believe they put up with me. I was talking about this in front of them so much.
Did you have a wall just full of?
I may as well have. I didn't, but I may as. At a certain point, I knew I had to transition from making them my only audience to moving on to a bigger one. But what I was basically doing was just trying out my own sense of, well, what does this all mean? Because the thing that I appreciate about, I think in the last 2 or 3 years in particular, there's been a growing wave of people, especially in the finance community and in the Bitcoin and cryptocurrency community, especially in the finance and Bitcoin communities on the younger side of things, who have gotten into this idea. And I'll think of one person in particular here, Brandon Quidham, who I had on the podcast about 8 months ago. Very bright guy, has his own ideas and sense of what the macroeconomic trends in the world mean in light of Neil and Bill's theory, how Bitcoin fits into that. I recommend people check out some of the commentary he's done about this. So there's other people who have chimed in and who aren't just sticking with the same old script. The conversation does still need to evolve, though, and the fact that increasingly people in the independent media space and the content creator space are millennials, or if you want to say Gen Z, they're getting younger. And I think in that situation, they can't possibly just take a theory developed in the 1990s at face value. We have our own lived experience of what the last 30 years have been like. It's not going to be the same as somebody who's 20 or 30 years old.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, I'm an electrician by day, and I work with quite a few guys that are in their early 20s. And, you know, it's interesting though, their perspective and what they lean to, as far as interest to get through the day compared to what us PTSD millennials have to do. So that's a good thing. That's a good thing. I think it is. And I do think, like, when you talk about a restoration in institutions, like we're still, loosely a few years away from that being fully established or that time coming. But I think we have seen the roots start to be put into place. People are starting to realize the value of just openly being able to communicate or to what they perceive as openness. This idea of, like, now Facebook is adopting the community notes standards. He went on his apology tour to Joe Rogan, which it was. I don't know if you watched that thing, but it was painful, but he did it. So, good for you, Zuck. But
Yeah.
There was. Have you seen it all the way through yet?
I admit I have not yet. I've just gone through a couple of sections of it. It seems like he's doing a CYA a little bit, but
yes.
But
they were mean to me. They yelled. They screamed. We were friends in 2012. Now they're being mean. Oh, come on. So that'll be interesting. That'll be interesting to see how that plays out for sure.
Yeah, well, he also knows he's got to make nice with the movement and the people who are coming in, because there's just I think people like Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos. I don't want to speak for the whole class of billionaire mega plutocrats, but I think even those who are not on the same side politically as Elon Musk, they know which way the winds are blowing, and they know that they have to sort of package what they're saying about how they're going to handle their company business, platform business going forward. They have to handle it differently now that the next 4 years are going to be different.
There's a clip of Trump. I haven't gotten it clip for the show yet, but he's sitting there talking. He's like, everyone was so mean to me my first term. Hey, everyone's coming up and they're super nice, and he's nice. I'm not complaining, but they were so mean the first time, and now they're hey, Mr. Trump. But yes, there's a interesting shift, and it doesn't feel to me, not including the turning theory, but just politically the vibes. It doesn't feel to me like we are out of the woods of anything yet, at all. There are strong ties to the beginning of World War II to what's going on right now, and it's like our politicians right now are dancing with the devil because, and nobody knows why.
There's a little bit of an echo, I think, to something that I recently talked about on the podcast, which is that at some point in the last, I'll say 3 or 4 years, I became aware that the people who were making the decisions in Europe in the 1920s and 30s between the world wars had this mindset that was just totally out of touch with reality. And it was essential, to sum it up in a single sentence, it was, well, we can't possibly have a crisis worse than the one we just lived with. Now we need all the experts and all the well-intentioned people to just make sure that we have an uninterrupted run of peace for the rest of time. But the world doesn't work that way. And I think that it's a little bit of a different dynamic, obviously, with how much money our politicians are throwing at Ukraine. And I wish I'd been keeping at least a mental note of how much money has been pledged or given to Ukraine just since November 5th. It's just an obscene amount of money. And it's a different application of the mindset of what was happening in the 30s in Europe, but it's the same logic. It's, the world can be fixed through the superior rationality of experts and cosmopolitans and people who just have the right degrees and the right connections. And it's like, no, that is not the way it works at all. And you're right. They really are dancing with the devil in a way. I just hope nothing happens in the next week before somebody new comes in.
Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the United States has committed approximately $56.3 billion. But they can't cover North Carolina or Lahaina, Hawaii, but they can take care of Malibu. They got that taken care under their wing. That is ridiculous. And I think it was just last week they sent some missiles that could fly 200 miles into the Russian border, and it wasn't Ukrainians controlling these missiles we gave them. We controlled them from our bases and sent them in. And this is no good. Who does that? 10 days before an election, or not an election, before a change of power. So it'll be interesting to see. We have that going on, and then of course this thing with Israel has turned into a much bigger ordeal than we were led to believe as well. I mean, like, you got the Syria issue. I mean, it just reminds me so much similarities. You got stuff going on in Africa. You got stuff going on in the Middle East. All of a sudden, Turkey wants to be, the Ottoman Empire again. Like, I just learned about the Ottoman Empire by Dan Carlin, for Christ's sakes. And now Turkey wants to regain that district. Israel supposedly has these plans to take over Jordan. They're already in Syria. Turkey's in Syria. I firmly believe on this show, like, we are already, our nation, obviously not to the extent of World War II, but I would say pre-World War II, we are already in a world war. We're just not being told about it. But as far as economic sanctions towards several countries, the fact that we cut off the ability for them to trade in any currency with any country, they can't even make a transfer of funds. The fact we hold all of the money and just froze assets, not to the political government, but to any, we did. There's a lot more to war than just throwing troops at a front line. There's a lot of other economic issues at play before it gets to that point. But man, it sure seems like they want to get to that point. What are your thoughts for people that are just learning about this book that came out in 1997? How would you say they should tackle it?
Well, I first listened to the Generation Report by the artist formerly known as Paul Zimmy Finn. There's a whole story of why I used that pseudonym for several years. But
Were you
But that aside,
were you afraid they were coming for you? Is that the
well, you know, what's funny is, you know, I picked up in the years before I started the podcast that, I mean, the book, to be clear, has fans on both sides of the political aisle, but the people who are both the greatest skeptics and the people who just dismiss it out of hand have a very specific set of views about the world and about themselves. And I also encountered, I haven't spoken very overtly about this on the podcast, but I've also encountered some situations in my personal life where I've wanted to engage people in some of this stuff. And if they had, it wasn't so much that their politics were so opposite of mine, it's that the fact that they could sense my politics were not exactly the same as theirs made me persona non grata with them. And that's
when you know they're in a cult. So
that's when I knew that they were locked in a mindset where, and that they were representatives of a mindset that exists among enough people where I said, I need to keep using a different name because it's just for self-interest and self-preservation. But I've now gotten to a point where, you know, time has passed. The world is starting to change at least a little bit. And I'm no longer willing in the same way as I was to just, you know, mask that up for what? You know, it's like, yeah, I've worked long and hard on this thing. And, you know, I kind of feel like putting my name out there is the best thing now. But that aside, I would say pick up the book if you're interested. Pick up some of Strauss and Howe's other books if you're intrigued enough by this conversation or by the Fourth Turning. But apply your own, I would say, apply your own experience and your own critical thinking to some of the things that either Neil Howe said in his most recent book, which came out 2 years ago, or take in the things that he and Bill Strauss were saying in the 90s, but through the lens of knowing how the world has changed since they wrote those books, and try to merge them together, which is what I've tried to do, but it's what other people in the same kind of space or same kind of headspace have also tried to do. And I think if this is just one of a million ideas that is out there that is helping people make a little more sense of things, but I think it's one of the best ones, if I maybe permitted to say that. And I think that the value in understanding this idea, but also using your own mind and incorporating your own experience, you can just feel like no matter what the world looks like today, or no matter how you feel about your own life right here, right now, it's going to change. And if you understand the way the world might change, your life might change for the better. And that, I think, is a benefit to everybody.
Well, I think a lot of people that just, you know, are only thinking, you know, 24 hours, you know, to the next day, which this world forces you sometimes to only be able to think that way. And the little bits of news they get on the radio on their drive to work, or, you know, when they sit down to eat the meal, it's not good. You know, there's a lot of bad focused on it. And I've talked to a lot of people that, you know, almost have, you know, just sort of a death row viewpoint on society. Either that, or they have, you know, they are awaiting for the rapture, you know, because the end times are nigh. And I feel like you can look back in time with, you know, during the crisis stage of this, and you'll see that type of thinking pop up. And for, you know, for people that are overwhelmed by this, there's no sense in being, because it all equalizes out, you know, and there is good that comes from bad, you know, like think of all the advancements in medicines, like, you know, actual miracles were done during World War II in medicine. You know, they discovered, you know, cures and surgery procedures that, you know, and it's sad because they had to experience that on a battlefield. But look at how many people it saved since that point. Not advocating for war, for Christ's sakes, but there's always like light at the end of the tunnel, and it's sad when you see these people, like, this is it. This is the end of the world.
It's definitely absolutely the way that I would sum it up is it's an antidote to nihilism. Even if you feel like we are approaching some kind of major cataclysm, and I have my days where I get stuck in thinking that also, at least having an understanding of where we are and why this set of ideas can give you that. And that's certainly what it did for me initially, now almost 11 long years ago, which is why I keep at it. Is, as I said in the beginning, when you graduating and hitting the adult world, the year the world essentially fell apart, I mean, that's going to be with me forever. There's,
I remember
there's a level of acceptance I've had to come to about that. And at the very least that I can say about this book and this set of ideas more broadly is that it let me know, okay, this is your place in the world. This is what you experienced, but your life's going to go on. How are you going to handle it? And I think that it's done that for a lot of people.
Yeah. And, I mean, I remember when the crash first happened, I was out on my own. I had just gotten back from New York. I had left the cult I was in, so like I was completely isolated in a new area, and I was able to rent this studio apartment. It was like $500 a month, and I didn't have a reliable car, so I'd have to like walk to the library, apply to, and I was an electrician, and there was nothing going on. No one was getting fired from those jobs, but they weren't, construction was dead, and unemployment I think it topped out at 11% in Iowa. And I remember listening on the radio, hearing about them telling about jobs in North Dakota. It's like it was zombie land. Get up to North Dakota. I hear there's work up there. I mean, just a very weird time after 2008. And then you had the Occupy Wall Street movement, the Tea Party movement. These movements politically that happened that normally, I remember growing up, and I don't remember a political movement doing anything, or my parents ever talking about a political movement. And then all of a sudden, these political movements not only are doing something, but they're getting their people elected into office. And it was a very interesting time to watch the world turn as well, obviously, I mean, and that was the merge into the fourth stage, correct? As you see it, yeah. So,
yeah, I think it would hard to be find. It would be hard to find more opposite poles, or poles that illustrate better the difference between the era in which we grew up as kids and the era in which we've been young adults politically, than the way the whole country was preoccupied for an entire year with Bill Clinton and Monica Lewinsky. And 20 plus years later, during that stretch of 2 years where the Democrats controlled the entire federal government, everybody knew Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema's names, because every single piece of legislation the Biden administration wanted to get passed depended on two otherwise relatively anonymous senators. There's no way that would have happened in 1998. And I think something like that scandal and all the moralizing and all the muck around, the prior situation wouldn't have commanded the same attention today. And that's illustrative of the difference with where America has gone since then. Like the stakes are really, really high now.
Yeah. Have you worked with anyone else on YouTube about this, or anyone else on YouTube caught your eye?
Well, I've as I said before, I recommend people check out Brandon Quittem if they're interested in sort of the macroeconomic applications of this set of ideas and how it applies to Bitcoin cryptocurrency. His insights are really good. There's a woman who is a longtime Hollywood blogger named Sasha Stone, who I spoke with last year. We had a great conversation last July, I want to say. The episode came out a little bit later, but we talked about a whole range of things, especially how woke Hollywood has gotten in the past 10 to 20 years. She has both a Substack and an iTunes channel called Free Thinking Through the Fourth Turning. There's some good content there. I recommend people check that out. Let me see who else. There's other people who have videos about it. There's other people who have YouTube shorts about it.
I find
they run the full gamut.
I find with like this show, when I'm like putting together content on a subject I'm researching, I find it hard to like watch similar shows that discuss the same thing, because I want to come to my own conclusion. Like I want to be able to do my own research and sort of, let my mind dig through it. And then after I've sort of come up with my synopsis, it's nice to bring in other people and play off with their ideas. And so like I get that, it's, especially with all the research you've done, you really have to be selective with who you're going to listen to and take points from as far as building your own thesis on it.
And of course, Steve Bannon talks about it a lot. If you really want to pare down to one reason or one person why I chose a pseudonym, it's Steve, who I have some mixed feelings about. He's incredibly bright, but he definitely puts his foot in his own mouth sometimes. And
and that's fine. You can be bright and you can be an idiot. I mean, he's Benjamin Franklin. Look at that guy. I mean, you have a guy that marketed himself very well, so well, in fact, that we still know who he is. And he was also a bit of an idiot too, like the stuff he went and did and his life outside of politics and business. He just he was a human being. That's a human being. That's what that is, And Steve Bannon is a caveman of a human being that just happens to be also very intelligent on some very specific issues. And that's the benefit of taking in information, is if you can separate personality from information flow. Like, is this person, does he have value in this one specific area? You got a guy that spent 10 years studying butterflies. You're not going to ask him about, climate change. You're going to ask him about the monarch butterfly. And you're going to learn something from him about it. And that's how I feel about a lot of these people. Like Steve Bannon was he's genius. Even how they took him off to jail, but at the same time, you'd be like, you are an idiot sometimes.
He's given the Fourth Turning an interesting reputation for people who want to step into these ideas too.
Your introduction to the Fourth Turning or the Turning?
No, what's funny is, so for those who don't know, Steve Bannon produced a documentary based upon the Fourth Turning. I want to say it came out around 2010. It was called Generation Zero, which I want to say that I watched for the first time in August or September of 2014, a few months after I picked up and read the Fourth Turning for the first time. For some reason, maybe it was just, not all my brain cells were working that day. I didn't directly connect the documentary with the roots that it had in the book until much later, and I really paid closer attention. But apparently he at that point in time had been obsessed with the book for a long time and had been using it to try to, influence people about, where to take certain populist movements in the country and what things were most concerning about what the administrative state, especially in DC, was doing. But he actually, I became, so it's a long way of saying I became aware that he was a fan of the book and had produced something about it after I read it, but it was shortly after I read it.
Well, it's interesting because it really took a hold of Washington. They loved this book. I came across the clip in '97 where Al Gore recommended the book, and then there's a whole list, not just it was bipartisan recommendations.
Well, what's interesting about the Al Gore thing is that, there has to, I think I should preface a little bit by saying, so Strauss and Howe's first book, Generations, it was called, it came out in 1991. And there's a certain segment of people, and I think a lot of these people are in Washington, D.C. and certain other professional circles, who actually, if anything, revere that book more than they revere the Fourth Turning, because when that came along, when that first book, Generations, came along, it was it's pretty much a brand new concept of how to view social change over time. You measure it by people, not sort of through more traditional means. And that's the book Al Gore grabbed onto and was just so effusive in praising that he sent a copy to every single other member of Congress.
Yes. Okay. I misunderstood that then. Okay.
And it was through that book that Strauss and Howe got the attention of a number of political elites in DC, including Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich also. I think Gingrich in particular was known to be a fan of their work, and I think he appeared in Generation Zero too. What's interesting about the Fourth Turning in comparison with Generations is that there was a 2 or 3 year period after the book Generations came out where you can look around YouTube and other parts of the internet where there's a very clear footprint of media being produced about Strauss and Howe's ideas based upon their first book, not upon the Fourth Turning. When the Fourth Turning came out, because it was more framing the narrative in terms of this is how social change over time happens, and it's going to lead to something big and probably cataclysmic for the country. There were certain people who, I don't want to say backed away from Strauss and Howe at that point, although I'm sure there were those too. But the media attention went from more of an embracing attitude to one of skepticism. And it's worth pointing that out because many of the big names who embraced them in the beginning have been, I think, presented as people who believe in their Fourth Turning theory, lock, stock, and barrel. And I don't know if that's necessarily the case.
Is that just maybe to be dismissive of what they're talking about by creating this false illusion that they're...
In part, yes. I think it's also because I think this is especially true among people of a certain ideological persuasion in the boomer generation, especially, where they believed once they kind of got a hold of this set of ideas that to the extent that it seemed legitimate, what it forecasted for the future was that there was going to be this great enlightenment of America that they would bring into being, and it would happen more or less peaceably and painlessly. The notion that the very survival of the country would feel at stake, which is a line that I think appears several times in the Fourth Turning. I don't believe it appears at all, or at least it's a far more muted sentiment expressed in Generations, the earlier book, the notion that the very survival of the country would hang in the balance is something that a lot of people didn't want to embrace because they were worried about how it would make them look. And just to wind down this one point with how I think it's playing out now is you can see in the group of people who Neil deals with professionally now and who he talks to on the podcast circuit, not exclusively, but for the most part, these are a lot of well-heeled people in the finance world, especially either in or connected with Washington, D.C., who I think by and large want to hear about the whole idea of cycles in history as something that's going to lead to a positive outcome in the end. And what I want,
soothsayer.
What's that?
He's essentially he's their soothsayer.
Yes, that oh, perfect. Yeah, he's the soothsayer, exactly. And what I want to contribute to, and other people have, I think, started to do also, is if they've gone as nutty and as deep into these ideas as I have, they want to sort of let it be known, this is no guarantee of good outcomes. This is just a process of change that happens because there is a certain pattern or rhythm to history that grows out of not just generational change, but human nature that we are all part of. We cannot alter or throw off course. We just have to ride with it and deal with it as long as it runs its course. Make the best decisions we can for ourselves and with, what people we connect with. And, we can do everything right. It still might not all turn out right in the end. The point is not to dwell in the negative so much, although that's easy. It's to say this pattern, this rhythm, this process is very, very real. And, hopefully people will incorporate at least a piece of it in how they see the world and how they see themselves.
Well, and there is a lot of positivity to be seen out there. I mean, the way X is being used, I mean, sure, there's a lot of disinformation and fake stuff being posted, but also when there was a school shooting in Wisconsin, within 40 minutes, we were able to see the entire dossier. We were able to know the father, the boyfriend, all the information was gathered in just record speeds that information has not been able to be conveyed before. And that may be not good in some short-term effects or long-term effects, to be honest. But when it comes to think about the Gulf of Tonkin in the 50s that started the Korean War.
So that's Vietnam.
The Tonkin was the Vietnam War?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I forget what the
what was the
situation was in Korea, but yeah.
I thought they faked one for Korea too. I can't. Maybe I got it mixed up there. But you're just not going to get that type of narrative so forced down a population's throat anymore. There's just going to be a million alternative narratives pushed out there at the same time, and people are pretty logical. And Community Notes has shown that you get a lot of people commenting on it, and it sort of just works itself out. It's a very odd concept and of course, like everything, it will eventually, if not already, face some sort of corruption, and they'll have to become a new way for truth to get out there. But for right now, I think it's a beautiful thing that people are able to communicate like this, like never before. And so when people get depressed about the future, I don't. It's a good. We're facing a really beautiful time where everyone's getting on the same page right now. Like this guy, I can talk to these guys in Pakistan. I can see these people in Russia, Ukraine. All these different countries, and you're starting to get a real awakening to the BS that was being fed to us for the past 60 years.
Yeah. So let me ask you, what do you see forward for the mainstream media? Because I go back and forth on thinking that they're just going to collapse and implode into themselves, or they're going to grow bigger than ever, but just be less influential and relevant than ever. How do you see that playing out? I'm interested in what you think.
I think that it's interesting that the theme this year for the CIA and these letter agencies and bureaucracies is to prove their worth to the American people and to restore faith in the institutions that have already failed them, and now the mass population's disassociated from them. So it'll be interesting to see them flail around, I think, this year. And I think that's what's going to happen. But I think you're seeing people, you're seeing the partisans on the far left and the far right take faith in institutions that are anti-normal media. And as far as people in the mid-center, I think there's just a general disinterest in, like, they watch the news, but there's no belief. Like, it's like, there's not a real belief. And I think that these companies that are like X and Facebook and Amazon, these might be considered the new institutions people put their faith in. It's not much different from the industrial age with America. The railroad systems, Carnegie. A lot of faith into these corporations to give people a better life, or to. I just don't see it going back to old institutions. That I'm not saying that the government's going to go away, but the government's going to, throw those institutions under the bus and establish their own, propaganda network that they're going to try to push hard.
Well, here's something that I have been thinking recently, and I maybe I'm the only one who thinks this, but I suspect I may not be the only one. Well, the ultimate test of what the reaction of the resistance is going to be is going to start a week from tomorrow. But we all remember what the social reaction was, ginned up by the media to be clear, in response to the things that came out during the latter part of the 2016 election cycle. But there was at least some, and I'm trying to emphasize that here, there was at least some of an organic social response to things that Trump said, for example. So in other words, the politicians were aligned against Trump. The DC establishment was aligned against Trump. The media was certainly aligned against Trump 8 years ago when he first came in, but there was also a sizable share of people who wanted to, pay their way to go to Washington, D.C. on inauguration weekend and make their voices heard because of things that they were indignant about. I wonder if we're going to see something as a reaction as diffuse as that across all of those different groups this time around. I'm starting to suspect that the group that is most consumed with derangement about Trump this time around is the media. At least that's how it seems to me. I don't know. Maybe I'll be proven wildly wrong in a week, and this will look ridiculous. But the media just seems to be really going to the ends of their rational faculties into complete crazy land, just because they can't believe he's going to be president again. And that's just going to lead to the end of their credibility if they just keep it up.
I think the credibility is already gone. I would say for 60% of Americans, those news networks, the credibility is gone. And and now it's gone so bad that comedians come on and make jokes about their ratings to their face, like and with no fear of repercussion. And also now you've seen it was very interesting with Trump showing up on Rogan. Rogan shows up on the news scene during the COVID debacle. That's really when he's first put into, how there's this guy. I remember there's a clip of The View talking about who is this guy, like the Fear Factor guy. And meanwhile, he has, 30 million views compared to their 300,000 or, whatever they have. And in 2016, the political campaigns did not respect alternative media. And Trump, even back then, would go on to lesser known radio shows. I mean, even went on the Alex Jones shows, of all shows to go on. But he knew there was an audience there of at least 30 million people. And so he went on there. And so, that backfired on the Democrats. And then whatever happened in 2020 happened. And then this time around, all of a sudden, the Democrats are going on podcasts and they're doing little skits and laughing on, it was a complete change of strategy on their part.
And to your point about alternate media and the way Trump kind of fit into it, I think for a number of reasons, the mean tweets are not going to be in evidence this time around as last time. And obviously lots of reasons for that. But I wonder if one of the reasons that he was known to be just taking to Twitter so much, to the artist formerly known as Twitter, to express his opinions about this or that thing that the media was doing or the Democrats were doing, was because the alternate media landscape had not grown in either size or influence to the extent that it is now. And supposedly, and I have no reason to think this isn't true, Barron Trump was a very big influence on his dad and going on a lot of the big podcasts, including Joe Rogan, which is interesting in itself.
Well, I think it's a beautiful thing because for 50 years, the American populace was fed entertainment in 22 minute and 13-second segments, not including commercials. And it was really a poor way to communicate any thoughtful discussion, but a great way to propagate you into thinking what you needed to think. And then podcasts come out. There's no way to regulate a podcast. No, I mean, Spotify cannot put it on there, but you can find a podcast player to play your favorite podcast. There's no way to regulate that. It's free speech. I mean, once it's out there, it's out there. And you podcasts come out, and then you have, some of these early players like Dan Carlin, teaching aspects of history people had never heard about. And, this guy would drop an episode once every 9 months, and it would crash Apple Podcasts because of all the people downloading it. And they were 5-hour-long podcasts, but it didn't matter. And the cable and TV media outlets, they just couldn't believe that anyone had the stomach for something 3 hours, 5 hours long. And so we have a really well-informed younger generation. And that's, Barron Trump is not, I can't tell you how many people of the younger generation, that's all they listen to is podcasts. There's no taking in of CNN. There's no kid. What kid do you talk to that watches CNN?
Yeah.
There's no way CNN is going to restore their credibility, but, there could be, there could come out a great news organization out of, who knows,
Yeah.
it's there will be, people have to put their faith in something, you can't just wander around without.
And so many people have talked about the the business models that they operate on and the content models, but what I think, and this is not to dismiss how important both of those points are and how rigid they've become, but as I didn't really start to even dive into it all until maybe 2.5, 3 years ago. The sort of people who populate those big news organizations, the uniformity across those people is unbelievable. You just obviously it's in the things that they say, but it's also where they went to school, what sort of trappings of, if you want to pick up a class sensibility from these people, there's very clearly one of those too. And they just presume that they're smarter and better than people. And it's like, no, you're not. No, you're not. And that is part of what fascinates, what is fascinating me and is going to continue to be something that I follow in the next few years as, the resistance amps up again. If it is coming mostly from the media this time around, and the dying legacy media in particular, that's going to be, I mean, I can't even imagine the depths that they're going to stoop to, because they're just completely afflicted with a mindset that no longer works with the world as it is.
Well, I think institutions collapse backwards, right? The less relevant stuff starts to fall first, and then it slowly, the more structural stuff begins to fall with it. And the decay, TV and those news media outlets, they're just there to reaffirm, right? They're just there to reaffirm whatever narrative needs to be reaffirmed according to I'm not saying the government's involved, according to what that news station's narrative needs to be, what CNN wants to talk about versus what Fox, and they have had their system for almost 100 years now, and they like it, they don't want to leave it, and now what you're seeing is that institution is falling apart, and the institution that I have seen start to crumble is the public school system, and that is the most major system, and the ground zero base for indoctrination is in the public school. That's where you build a strong society, and indoctrination is not an evil word by nature. That's where you teach civics. That's where you teach manners. That's where you teach interaction with your future community members. And all of that has started to, really decay. They talk about the sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church. You'll hear that all the time. But the sex abuse scandals in the public school system is worse. But you won't ever hear that discussed. Right. And well, now you're starting to, but it took 20 years of people to figure out what was going on, and making connections and doing like what you're doing now with your studies. And so I think that's a good sign. But for the public school system, for that to collapse, I think what institution replaces that is gonna that's because you're gonna have to have some sort of educated class.
And the universities, I have no idea what's going to happen with them.
Well, and you talk
I wish I could predict something, but I have no idea.
You talk about in 2008, and I remember, because my ex at the time, her job was getting students signed up for their, I think, was it a FISA application?
Okay. Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about, which was their loan, which I think they eventually had to pay back at high interest rates, right? But you could get into community college for free, essentially. You didn't have to pay it till 3 years later, and which sounded beautiful, right? That was a beautiful thing to do. There's a lot of people struggling in 08. Let's put them in college, teach them some things. But what I noticed is that for any of these community colleges to get that funding, they had to have a certain type curriculum and a certain type of study material that was all unified throughout all these states. And what a great way to program a whole class of HR, and essentially that's what became the head of these corporations, was those people in 2010 2008 all being taught the same thing. And like you said, one thing that fascinated me about being raised in a cult is that I was so self-assured that I was right. And I could prove my point to anyone because I had an answer for everything. And that was because that's what the church taught me. We literally had books on how to disprove this faith, how to disprove this faith, how to do this, how to do that, how to use this scripture to combat this scripture. And there was this confidence that came from that, knowing that those things. And of course, after you leave and you sort of realize they were quote miming and all this stuff that was going on. But then I see the same self-assuredness that come out of these people, that come out of these college systems, where it's just like, well, I have a degree and I know exactly where to look in the book to find out what's going on. And I'm like, well, they taught them critical thinking, and in the process made them cognitively dissonant. It's very impressive.
And this dovetail that's so true. And this dovetails to something that I've been turning my own gears on for a while, to try to think of a way to present it in a podcast format that's as concise and as to the point as I can make it, which is that the phenomenon you're describing is 100% real. And what makes it meaningful for me as somebody who has taken a dive into these ideas for a very long time is I can see the generational aspect to the fact that what you're talking about is 100% real, that there's a sizable number of people out there who have a degree, regardless of what kind of life they're living or where they live. The fact that they have a degree and they've had a belief system that they've never ventured outside for maybe their entire life, they know they're right about everything. And carrying that stuff around in the face of a whole lot of evidence that maybe you should change the way you see the world or the way you see a particular issue, it's a phenomenon that is not exclusive to one age group or one generation, but I've seen a lot of examples of it among people my age, among people I know, and where this kind of dovetails with the conversation we were having about the media is that I see a whole lot of these millennials who are faces for the big media organizations, whether it's the flagship print media or the big cable news outlets or the legacy broadcast outlets. And I can just pick up like that these are people with no critical thinking inclinations whatsoever. And that's scary.
Well, and especially, the mega movement as it was in 2016 was really a mixture of what ended up being Bernie supporters, people who were upset with the rhinos of the Republican Party and the Tea Party. And now the mega movement is something very different. It is it's almost like he's the Pope, and that's not good either. That's
that can go its own way too.
That's not good either. Those are Hitler vibes, and they're right to say that because that's exactly what Hitler did. He came into a destroyed economy with the people that had no self-esteem, and gave them a little bit of hope, and told them that I got to do it my way though, and so and I'm not saying it's going to go that way, but I'm just saying that there is a group of Hitler had the brown shirts, and they were, the fanatical fascists, and it's hard to, and the left has their own issues, obviously. There's no joke. Both sides have their polarized opposites, but the one side's coming into power now, and so it'll be very interesting. This this collapse of institutions. I keep coming back to it because it's, you see it everywhere. You see it, like we've been talking about in the media. We see it, corporations. We've talked about the assassination of that United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson, and the reaction is what I'm most fascinated by. It's a fascinating reaction, and I love how people are trying to be so dismissive of it on legacy media, and both sides of the spectrum of media. MSNBC to Fox News, both of them are like, yeah, we shouldn't do that. It's really bad. Anyone that thinks that this is okay, and then you go on to open source networks, and it's everyone is. They're showing stats of how many this guy killed while he was CEO, and very different reaction from what we're being told, and that is an underbelly that has yet to surface itself. And I almost feel if it, I feel like it's a pivotal point. Like we'll come back to that at some point. Thank God that was the start of, is that the new school shooting? Is just they go into boardrooms and I don't want to start that here, but you know what I'm saying. Like it's interesting these collapses of different, and then with health, we're learning the agricultural business, and got involved in making soybean oils and all these things. The food pyramid was written up by the agricultural committees out there for it just mass deceit on our how to feed. My parents thought they were, I remember my mom studying those charts trying to make sure we ate healthy, and they were all a lie. The food pyramid's a lie. So we're seeing these collapse in institutions too. But like I said, eventually people have to put faith in something, and maybe putting faith in local communities is the restoration of these institutions that we need to see. It doesn't necessarily have to be this huge global scale all the time.
Yep. Yeah, definitely. With respect to the United Healthcare shooting of Brian Thompson, what struck me about the reaction was, and you kind of touched on it, is that people were expressing how upset they were about his murder, and then not just from one side of the aisle, but from one in particular, you would hear but on some level I can understand this. And I kept going, how can you rationalize this? If we're now at a point where terrible things like that are going to be rationalized because somebody runs a healthcare company, I'm convinced something like that could happen again. And we already, actually, in a way, we already saw it with Trump, because within a week after he was shot, that event was memory hold. And a whole lot of people have given a whole lot of examples of the way, including the big social media platforms, prevented people from even doing searches on it. That's terrifying.
Yeah, and it's a sign of it's a sign of a population that's suffering. When you see things like that, that's a sick civilization that that has medical issues. I see these commercials and say 1 in 5 kids have mental illness. I don't know if you've seen that commercial. And
I haven't, but I'm not surprised. Yeah,
it drives me nuts because words matter, And to say that a child is something versus has something makes a difference. And so to make it a part of their personality at a very young age, oh no, this is just who you are. This symptom we've diagnosed you with for long term, and then they're giving them experimental drugs for a long time. You know, you're talking 30 years of experimental drugs, and then you have reactions like this in society. I mean, 1 in 5 kids have a mental health issue, means that 1 in 5 kids are medicated. That that's a crazy that's a crazy amount of children there.
Yeah,
That now, and that started in the 90s, you know,
it did. I remember very well the first person I ever knew, the first kid I ever knew who was put on an ADD. We used to call it ADD. It wasn't ADHD in the 90s. It's one of those 90s relics, like the food pyramid. The first kid I ever knew who was given medication for it was when I was in 4th grade. And it was sort of like, you know, I remember being very puzzled, like, you're getting medicine for this? And now it, you know, it seems quaint to even think that, you know, that would be a surprise. But as you said, it's all over the place. It's just all over the place.
We did a little clip the other day of this doctor talking about how the pharmaceutical industry, when it was established originally, was to just pick out certain things and provide a pill that would last a week, 2 weeks, a month, that they could take. And it wasn't until after World War II when the pregnancy prevention pill was invented that they realized that they could make someone take a pill for 40 years. And this had not been something any of the pharmaceutical companies had even considered. And it was after that point you start to see a slow rise in long-term diseases, and there being long-term medications associated with it. It's just sort of an interesting little sidebar about what you were saying there.
And I remember, and to just piggyback on that, I remember I've had a number of conversations with family, mostly recently, about, you know, Robert Kennedy Jr. talked both in his book about Anthony Fauci and, you know, on the podcast circuit and on the campaign trail about, you know, the sudden pivot that took place in, you know, childhood allergies and you know, autism cases happening at a very specific point in time. And I don't remember that many specific examples of kids that I knew in my own life who were afflicted by something like this. But I do remember, mostly because I had a brother who was in 1st grade at the time the peanut allergy epidemic just swept through the area where I grew up, that there was this big scare that went on over allergies that nobody had even seen coming when I was going through the system a few years before, and it was hitting people my brother's age. So when I heard Robert Kennedy Jr. say later that there's a very clear point of departure where kids who were getting these scheduled mandatory vaccines born in 1989 are having a much greater incidence of, you know, not just allergies, but severe allergies. It immediately made sense to me, because I remembered in my own life, just because of the way my mind kind of works and thinking in timelines, I was like, oh, that happened when people born about that time, you know, were going through school, and it changed schools in a big way. It's one of those aspects, and if you want to fit it into the generations thing, it's one of those aspects of the millennial story that I wish, you know, people who endeavor to be generational experts would incorporate, because it hasn't all been, you know, sunshine and roses just because we were protected more as kids. You know, there were a lot of trade-offs that came with it, and not all in just styles of parenting, a lot of them happened in things that nobody foresaw, like the allergies and autism spikes that happen.
Well, and the misdiagnosing of children so that they would conform to a public school system.
Yep.
You know, I mean, that is, think about the generations lost. You know, we're what, 4 generations now into that. You know, my brother came in with the ADHD, and I remember that. You triggered that thought in me, because I remember my mom telling people, and they're like, "Oh, he has ADD," and she's like, "No, it's ADHD." You know, you have to correct him because it was the new form. But he was on Ritalin till he was 13, I think. He was on Ritalin, you know, and you know, you wonder, man, what are the side effects from something like that? I see that every school shooter has been on some sort of SSRI, you know, but that's never talked about. You know.
Were the Columbine shooters
so
on that as well?
Fascinating. We went down that rabbit hole a couple years ago, and the lawyer that represented those boys, John DeCamp, from Lincoln, Nebraska, and after that, he went after the pharmaceutical companies in a lawsuit in which they had to put a warning label on, like, Prozac and lithium, that it may cause, you know, suicidal thoughts, or, you know, when they read that now. And it was because those boys were both on SSRIs.
Okay.
They had been put on it a year before. They had broken into a work truck, and part of their punishment for not, you know, one of their things was they had to go to therapy and go on meds.
That's right. Yeah. That's one of those details about that tragedy that I'd since forgotten, but I'm not surprised.
So every school shooting has had someone who's been on some sort of SSRI.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a, you know, think about that, you know, and now we're going into, you know, a population of adults that are, you know, we haven't seen the 30, 40-year results of that yet. So we're going to, yeah. Well, Andy, thank you so much for coming on the show and talking about all this stuff.
Oh, my pleasure. Great.
So, and you're welcome on the show anytime. Anytime something new comes up and you want to discuss it or anything like that, just give me a ring. I have like a strep throat, sort of, it's not strep throat, some sort of cold thing that my tongue is all swollen in the back. So if I sounded like a fat lipped ginger, that is why for this interview.
What are you thinking for the Chiefs prospects in the playoffs? You're a big Chiefs fan?
I'm not at all. I'm a Vikings.
Oh.
I'm from the north. No,
are they playing tomorrow or do they play today?
They play tomorrow. What happened? We're doing NFL on playoffs on Monday night. That's horrible. And then they got to turn around and they're going to have to play who? I think the Lions. Will they have to play the Lions again?
Oh, maybe. I'd have to look at the bracket again. Ever since one of the trade-offs that's come, anybody who knows me personally will tell you that I'm one of the true sports diehards from way back, and a lot of this stuff has kind of been put aside as I've been working on this podcast. So when little details about, you know, playoff seedings, especially in the NFL, I'm always kind of like, oh,
it's funny when you start when you start going down wormholes. Like I told my girlfriend this too years back. I said, I give myself 12 weeks out of the year where all I do every Saturday, I'm just going to watch college football and pretend nothing is wrong with the world. And I'm going to yell at the TV. You're going to see a side of me. And then after that 12 weeks is over, you know, I can't even like give myself the NFL the full attention till playoffs, you know, because there's, you know what it's being used for. It's just a big distraction tool. So, but I allow myself one distraction, you know, that's,
as a dyed in the wool Patriots fan and someone who, admittedly, I didn't suffer that long with the Red Sox, but I will say,
Oh, really?
I'm rooting hard for you guys to win a Super Bowl before Buffalo.
Yeah.
Like just
Yes.
between you guys and Buffalo, I'm going with you guys any day.
You're so petty. It's disgusting.
East Coast, AFC East, American League East. Oh yeah.
So I'm
comes with the territory.
Vikings fan, and I'm a Twins fan, and big Twins fan. And when I got into baseball, my dad was a Red Sox fan, and my mom was a Yankees fan, and so I grew up watching. That was the best time of baseball, dude, watching those two teams go at it. And we would go, and the first year I saw the Red Sox play was in 2003. I think that's when they won their first World Series, right?
No, it was 2004, but yeah, ballpark, yeah.
It was that year, 2004, because Makovich was our first baseman, and he played a game for us against the Red Sox, and then we traded him that night to the Red Sox. So the next day, he played for the Red Sox at the Twin Stadium, and everyone applauded him. It was a nice little moment. But David Ortiz hit the highest fly ball I have ever seen in my life. I didn't know it was humanly possible to shoot a ball up that high. It blew my mind. So I have a soft spot in my heart for the Red Sox. Hate the Yankees. All right, Andy. Have a good evening. I kept you up a little later than I promised, but
no, that's perfectly all right. Yeah, I'm always eager to have great conversations with people who are interested in these kind of stuff and painting the big picture. And this has been great. And I just want to thank you again, Corey, for having me on. And I hope we'll catch up again soon.
Andy, the Generation Report. We appreciate you so much, sir, for coming on. This is Andy from the Generation Report. Gentlemen, I think it's time to call it a night. Thank you, everyone, for watching the show, and we'll catch you. Oh, a couple plugs here. January 22nd, 10 days from tomorrow, we have Richard Gage coming on. He is the founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. 911.org, and there's been a lot of chatter about the 7 pages getting released supposedly on the 20th, and I'm just dying to get his take on the jabs at Tower 7 that he's been getting from the former CIA lady there, and then Spike Cohen will be coming on February. To the show. End of February, Spike Cohen will be coming on. So we got a couple fun stuff lined up. We'll see you Wednesday at 8 p.m. Everybody.
This is the emergency broadcast system. This is not a test. Repeat, this is not a test. This is our home station. If exposed, remove from the boat.
Podcast for the curious mind. I don't know what that means.